The desert wind carried secrets that could destroy nations, and Chenoa knew them all. Standing in the golden light of dawn, with Nash Bradley's calloused hand pressed firmly against her lips, she understood that love had become their death sentence. She could feel his heart pounding through his torn shirt, the same rhythm that had haunted her dreams for weeks. His green eyes, usually so confident and rebellious, now held a desperation that made her stomach clench. Behind them, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Cavalry soldiers searching for the woman who disappeared from her father's camp. The woman who now held intelligence that could spark a war between two worlds. But here's what those soldiers didn't know yet. Nash Bradley wasn't just another drifter who'd fallen for a chief's daughter. He was the man they'd sent to gather information about her people's movements, their sacred places, their weaknesses. A man who was supposed to report back with details that would help the U.S. Army claim the richest gold deposit ever discovered in Montana Territory. And Chenoa? She wasn't just any chief's daughter. She was the keeper of her tribe's most ancient prophecies, the woman who'd seen visions of white men bleeding the sacred mountains dry. She'd been chosen by the spirits to protect secrets that had been buried for generations. Secrets about the true source of the gold that drove men mad with greed. The irony was crushing. They'd each been tasked with betraying the other's people, but instead they'd fallen into a love so deep it threatened to drown them both. Nash's thumb gently stroked her cheek as his hand remained over her mouth, a tender gesture that contrasted sharply with the restraint. They both knew that one word from her, one cry for help or warning, would bring her father's warriors thundering over the ridge, and one word from him to his commanding officer would sign her death warrant before sunset. But what made their situation truly impossible was the secret they discovered together just 3 nights ago, hidden in the darkness of Moon Canyon. The secret that changed everything they thought they knew about the coming war, about the gold, about why so many innocent people were about to die. The hoofbeats were getting closer now. Any moment the cavalry patrol would round the boulder that concealed them, and then they'd have to make the choice that had been tearing them apart since the moment they realized the truth. Because in this harsh land where loyalty meant survival and betrayal meant death, they'd stumbled onto something bigger than their forbidden love, bigger than the conflict between their peoples. They'd uncovered a conspiracy so massive that it could reshape the entire American frontier, if they lived long enough to expose it. Nash leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered the words that would define everything that followed. Remember what we promised each other, Chenoa. No matter what happens in the next few minutes, no matter who gets hurt, we take this secret to our graves. The sound of horses grew thunderous. Time was running out, and the story of how a Lakota prophet and a guilt-ridden cavalry scout discovered that their love was the least dangerous thing about them, that story was just beginning. 3 weeks earlier, Nash Bradley had been just another soldier following orders. Now, crouched behind sun-bleached rocks, with his hand over the mouth of the woman he'd been sent to betray, he wondered how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. It had started with a simple mission briefing in Colonel Harrison's tent at Fort Laramie. Nash remembered the whiskey-stained map spread across the wooden table, the way the lamplight flickered across the old man's scarred face as he outlined what should have been a routine reconnaissance assignment. "Bradley, you've got the best record with Indian negotiations in this entire regiment," Harrison had said, tapping his finger on a spot marked in red ink. "I need you to get close to Chief Running Bear's people. Learn their patterns, their sacred sites, their weaknesses, the railroads coming through whether they like it or not." Nash had nodded, same as he'd done a dozen times before. Infiltrate, gather intelligence, report back. Clean and simple, except this time the colonel had leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspirative whisper. "There's something else, son. Something that doesn't leave this tent." Harrison's eyes had gleamed with a hunger Nash had never seen before. "Our geological surveys found something in those hills, something that's going to change everything. Gold. Not just traces or small deposits, but what the surveyors were calling the richest vein ever discovered west of California. Enough gold to fund the entire westward expansion, enough to make every man involved wealthy beyond imagination. The only problem was its location. buried deep within the sacred burial grounds of the Lakota people, land that had been promised to them by federal treaty. Promises can be renegotiated, Harrison had said with a cold smile, especially when the other party is no longer in a position to object. Nash had felt something twist in his stomach even then, but he'd pushed it down. He was a soldier. Soldiers followed orders. It wasn't until 3 days later, when he'd first laid eyes on Chenoa dancing around the sacred fire, that he understood how completely his world was about to implode. She moved like water given form, her beaded dress catching the firelight as she performed the ancient ritual of the autumn harvest. Her dark hair flowed loose around her shoulders, and when she turned, Nash caught a glimpse of her face, high cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes, and a smile that seemed to hold secrets older than the mountains themselves. But it wasn't just her beauty that stopped his breath. It was the way she moved through the ceremony with such reverence, such connection to something greater than herself. Nash had spent years viewing the Lakota as obstacles to progress, but watching Chenoa, he glimpsed something sacred that his people were preparing to destroy. The plan was working perfectly at first. Nash had approached the tribal camp under the guise of a traveling trader, offering quality goods at fair prices. Chief Running Bear, Chenoa's father, was cautious but not unwelcoming. The Lakota had traded with honest white men before, and Nash played his role well. What he hadn't counted on was Chenoa's intelligence. While other members of the tribe saw only another trader, she watched him with sharp, calculating eyes. She noticed how his gaze lingered on the sacred sites, how he asked seemingly innocent questions about the mountains and their spiritual significance. The confrontation came on his 5th day in the camp. Nash was examining the area near the burial grounds, trying to determine the exact location of the gold deposit, when a shadow fell across his path. "You're not just a trader," Chenoa said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. She stood 10 feet away, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to run if needed. "Traders don't spend so much time studying burial grounds." Nash turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the concealed pistol at his hip. But when he met her eyes, he found himself frozen. There was no fear there, no accusation, just a deep, knowing sadness that cut through him like a blade. "You're right," he heard himself saying, the lie he'd prepared dying on his lips. "I'm not just a traitor." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the dusty ground. The wind whispered through the sacred stones, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that felt like destiny shifting on its axis. "My father suspects," Chenoa said finally. "He wants to believe you're honest, but the spirits have been restless since you arrived. They whisper of danger coming from the east." Nash felt his chest tighten. "And what do you think?" Chenoa stepped closer, close enough that he could see the intricate beadwork on her dress, close enough to catch the faint scent of wildflowers in her hair. "I think you're a man torn between duty and conscience. I think you came here with orders you believed were right, but now you're not so sure." The accuracy of her assessment left him speechless. How could she read him so clearly when he barely understood himself? "There's something you need to see," she continued, glancing around to make sure they weren't being watched. "Something about these mountains that your people don't understand." Against every instinct he'd been trained to follow, Nash found himself nodding. Chenoa led him away from the burial grounds, up a winding path that seemed to disappear into the rock face itself. They climbed for 20 minutes before she stopped at what appeared to be a solid wall of stone. "This is Moon Canyon," she said, pressing her hand against a particular section of rock. To Nash's amazement, the stone pivoted inward, revealing a hidden passage. Only the keepers of the sacred knowledge know of this place. Inside the canyon, Nash's world tilted on its axis. The walls were covered in ancient petroglyphs, but that wasn't what stole his breath. It was the gold. Not veins running through rock, but massive chunks of pure gold embedded in formations that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "This is why the spirits are restless," Chenoa said, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "They know what your people plan to do. They've seen it in visions, the sacred burial grounds torn apart, our ancestors' bones scattered like leaves, all for this cursed metal." Nash stared at the gold, understanding for the first time the true magnitude of what Harrison planned. This wasn't just about wealth or expansion. This was about obliterating an entire culture for profit. How long have you known? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. About you specifically? Since the day you arrived. About your people's intentions? The spirits began warning us months ago. Chenoa turned to face him, and in the strange golden light of the canyon, she looked like something out of legend. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Nash felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. His duty to the army, his loyalty to his own people, his growing feelings for this woman who should have been his enemy, all of it crashed together in a moment of perfect, terrible clarity. I don't know, he admitted. If I warn your people, I'll be shot as a traitor. If I don't. He gestured helplessly at the gold surrounding them. Chenoa stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. There might be another way, she said softly, but it would require trust. Complete trust between us. What kind of trust? Nash asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything. Instead of responding with words, Chenoa reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a gentleness that made his heart race. In that touch, Nash felt the barriers between their worlds dissolving, felt the possibility of something neither of them had dared to imagine. The kind of trust that could get us both killed, she whispered. Outside the hidden canyon, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Nash Bradley was about to discover that falling in love with the enemy was only the beginning of his problems. Because in 3 days, Colonel Harrison would send a message that would force Nash to choose between his conscience and his life. And Chenoa would reveal a secret about the gold that would make their forbidden love seem like the least dangerous thing in the territory. The real question wasn't whether they could trust each other. It was whether they could survive what was coming next. The next 3 weeks became a dance with death. Though neither Nash nor Chenoa fully understood the steps they were learning, their meetings began innocently enough, or as innocently as secret rendezvous between a cavalry spy and a chief's daughter could be. Nash would slip away from the tribal camp each evening, ostensibly to check his horse or gather firewood. Chenoa would disappear from her father's lodge under the pretense of collecting medicinal herbs or seeking spiritual guidance at the sacred sites. They always met at Moon Canyon, that hidden sanctuary where ancient spirits watched over stolen moments between two people who should have been enemies. Tell me about your world, Chenoa said one evening, as they sat beside a small fire Nash had built near the canyon's entrance. The golden walls reflected the flames, creating the illusion that they were sitting inside a jewel. Tell me why your people need this land so desperately that they're willing to break every promise they've made. Nash stared into the fire, wrestling with words that felt like betrayal no matter how he arranged them. It's not about need, he said finally. It's about fear. Fear? Chenoa's dark eyes reflected the firelight as she waited for him to continue. Fear of being left behind. Fear of other countries growing stronger while we stay the same. Fear that if we don't keep expanding, keep claiming new territory, someone else will claim it first. Nash picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hands. My grandfather fought in the Revolution. My father fought in the War of 1812. I fought in Mexico. We're a nation built on the idea that we have to keep fighting, keep moving west, or we'll die. And what do you think will happen if you stop fighting? Chenoa asked quietly. Nash looked up at her, seeing not just the beautiful woman who had somehow invaded his thoughts every waking moment, but the representative of a people his nation was determined to destroy. Honestly, I think we're terrified to find out. Chenoa nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd long suspected. My people have a different fear. We're afraid of forgetting who we are. The white man's world. It swallows everything. Your language, your buildings, your way of thinking. It spreads like water through sand, and when it's done, nothing of the original remains. Is that why you learn English so well? Nash asked. To understand the enemy? A smile played at the corners of Chenoa's mouth. I learned English because my grandmother had visions. She saw that the future would require bridges between our worlds, and bridges need builders who understand both sides. Her expression grew serious. She also saw that most of those bridges would be built with blood. The weight of that prophecy settled between them like a physical presence. Nash found himself reaching for Chenoa's hand without conscious thought. needing the reassurance of her touch to ground him in a reality that felt increasingly surreal. "What else did your grandmother see?" he asked. Chenoa's fingers intertwined with his, and Nash felt his pulse quicken at the simple contact. She saw a warrior from the eastern winds who would bring both salvation and destruction. A man torn between two loyalties, who would have to choose between love and duty. Her eyes met his. She saw me standing at a crossroads, forced to decide between saving my people and saving my heart. Nash's breath caught. "Do you think—" "I think my grandmother was very wise," Chenoa said softly. "And I think we're both walking into her vision, whether we want to or not." Their conversations grew deeper as the weeks passed, each evening bringing new revelations that should have driven them apart, but instead drew them closer together. Nash found himself sharing stories about his childhood in Missouri, about the farm his family had lost to drought and debt, about his decision to join the army not from patriotism, but from desperation. Chenoa spoke of her role as a keeper of the sacred knowledge, of the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders since childhood to preserve the spiritual traditions of her people. She taught him the meanings behind the petroglyphs in Moon Canyon, explaining how each symbol represented not just a story, but a piece of living history that connected her people to the land itself. "This is why the gold doesn't matter," she said one night, tracing the outline of an ancient spiral carved into the canyon wall. "Your people see wealth. We see the veins of the earth, the blood of our ancestors flowing through stone. To tear it out would be like cutting out someone's heart while they're still alive." Nash felt something twist inside his chest as he watched her fingers move over the ancient carving. "Chenoa, there's something I need to tell you about the mission I was sent on." She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw not surprise but a deep, patient sadness. "I know, Nash. I've known from the beginning. You know that I'm supposed to report on our weaknesses, map our sacred sites, help your people plan their attack." Chenoa's voice was steady, but Nash could see the pain she was fighting to hide. "The question is, are you still planning to do it?" Nash felt the world narrow to this moment, this choice that would define everything that followed. In the distance, he could hear the sound of drums from the tribal camp, the rhythmic heartbeat of a people who trusted him, who had welcomed him into their lives while he planned their destruction. "I don't know," he said honestly. 3 weeks ago, the answer would have been yes without question. Now, Chenoa prompted, "now I look at you, at your people, at what you're trying to preserve, and I can't figure out who the real enemy is supposed to be." Chenoa moved closer, close enough that Nash could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin. "Perhaps that's because there doesn't have to be an enemy. Perhaps there's another way." "What other way?" Nash asked, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. Having her so close was making it difficult to think clearly. Instead of answering immediately, Chenoa reached up and touched his face, her palm resting against his cheek with a tenderness that made his heart race. "The spirits have been showing me dreams," she whispered. "Dreams of a future where the gold stays hidden, where your people find what they need somewhere else, where the sacred places remain sacred." "That's not how the world works, Chenoa. My commanding officer—" "Your commanding officer doesn't know about Moon Canyon," she interrupted. "He doesn't know the true extent of what lies hidden here. What if we could show him that the cost of taking this land would be higher than any potential gain?" Nash stared at her, trying to understand what she was suggesting. "You mean sabotage the mission?" "I mean give him a reason to look elsewhere for his gold." Chenoa's thumb traced along his jawline, sending shivers down his spine. "There are other deposits in the territory, smaller ones that don't require disturbing sacred ground. What if those deposits became easier to find? What if the surveying reports for this area somehow disappeared?" The audacity of what she was proposing took Nash's breath away. "That would be treason. If you're caught, you'll hang," Chenoa finished for him. "But if you do nothing, my people will be slaughtered. The sacred sites will be destroyed, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you could have prevented it." Nash felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him again, but this time, something else was fighting back against the pressure. Something that felt like hope, dangerous and intoxicating. "There's something else," Chenoa continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told you about the Golden Moon Canyon." "What?" "It's cursed." Nash blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Cursed? The spirits that guard this place? They don't just protect the physical gold. They protect the balance between worlds. Every piece of gold taken from here comes with a price. The Spanish learned that 200 years ago when they tried to mine these hills. Disease, madness, death. It followed them until none remained." "Chenoa, you can't seriously believe—" "I don't have to believe it," she said firmly. "Your people do. Your commanding officer is a superstitious man, isn't he? I've heard the traders talk about how he won't make major decisions without consulting his lucky coins, how he refuses to sleep in any tent that faces north." Nash felt his pulse quicken as he began to understand what she was suggesting. Colonel Harrison was indeed notoriously superstitious, a quirk that most of his men found amusing, but worked around. "You want to convince him the gold is cursed," Nash said slowly. "I want to convince him that taking this gold will destroy his men, his career, and his soul," Chenoa replied. "And I want you to help me do it." Nash stared at her, seeing not just the woman he was falling in love with, but a strategic mind that could outmaneuver seasoned military officers. "How?" Chenoa smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, Nash saw something dangerous glittering in her dark eyes. "Leave that to me. But first, there's something else we need to discuss." "What?" "In 5 days, there's going to be a ceremony, a sacred ritual to honor the autumn spirits and ask for their protection through the winter." Chenoa's hand moved from his face to rest over his heart. "My father wants me to choose a husband during the ceremony, a warrior who can help lead our people through the difficult times ahead." Nash felt his blood turn to ice. And I've been thinking about what my grandmother's visions really meant, about bridges between worlds, and the warrior from the eastern winds, and the choice between love and duty." Chenoa leaned closer, so close that her lips almost brushed his ear as she spoke. "I think maybe the choice isn't between love and duty. Maybe the choice is about finding a new kind of duty, one that serves love instead of destroying it." Nash's heart hammered against his ribs as he processed what she was saying. "Chenoa, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, I'm suggesting that in 5 days, you're going to have to decide whether you're brave enough to help me change the course of history," she whispered, "because that's when I'm going to need you most." Before Nash could respond, Chenoa pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "But first, I need to know something." "What?" "I need to know if what I see in your eyes when you look at me is real. Because if we're going to risk everything, I need to know that we're risking it for something worth dying for." Nash felt the last of his resistance crumble as he stared into her face, illuminated by firelight and starshine. Without speaking, he reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones as he memorized every detail of this moment. "It's real," he whispered. "God help us both. It's real." When their lips met, it felt like the collision of two worlds, the birth of something entirely new and entirely dangerous. And somewhere in the darkness beyond Moon Canyon, the spirits whispered warnings of the storm that was coming. 5 days had never felt so much like 5 lifetimes. Nash found himself counting each sunrise like a condemned man, marking his final hours. Watching Chenoa move through her daily routines, while knowing that everything they'd built together was about to be tested in ways that could destroy them both. The tribal camp buzzed with preparation for the autumn ceremony. Women worked tirelessly on ceremonial garments, their fingers flying as they wove intricate patterns that told the stories of their ancestors. Men sharpened weapons and practiced ritual dances, their movements precise and powerful under the watchful eye of Chief Running Bear. Nash tried to maintain his cover as a simple trader, but he could feel the weight of suspicious glances from some of the younger warriors. Word had spread that Chenoa would choose a husband during the ceremony, and more than one brave had noticed how often the white trader seemed to find excuses to be near the chief's daughter. The most persistent of these was Takota, a fierce warrior whose reputation in battle was matched only by his devotion to preserving traditional ways. Nash had watched him watching Chenoa, had seen the possessive gleam in his dark eyes whenever she spoke to any man, white or otherwise. The traitor spends too much time studying our sacred places, Dakota said one evening, his voice carrying clearly across the fire where Nash sat pretending to read. Perhaps he sees value in things that should not be valued by his people. Chief Running Bear's response was measured, diplomatic. Perhaps he seeks understanding. Knowledge shared honestly builds stronger bridges than knowledge taken by force. And what if his knowledge is not honestly shared? Dakota pressed. What if he carries our secrets back to those who would use them against us? Nash felt every muscle in his body tense, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still, perfectly calm. Any reaction would only fuel suspicion, and he was already walking a knife's edge between discovery and disaster. Then we would deal with such betrayal as our ancestors did, Running Bear replied, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. But until a man proves himself unworthy of trust, we honor the laws of hospitality. That night, Nash met Chenoa at Moon Canyon with his nerves strung tighter than a bowstring. She emerged from the hidden passage like a spirit materializing from stone. But instead of her usual warm smile, her face was marked by lines of strain he'd never seen before. Dakota suspects you, she said without preamble. He's been asking questions, making observations. My father trusts you, but that trust is fragile. Nash nodded grimly. I know, I can feel it. Maybe I should leave. Disappear before the ceremony and find another way to… No. The firmness in Chenoa's voice stopped him cold. If you leave now, it will confirm every suspicion. And besides, she moved closer, her hand finding his in the darkness. Running away won't solve our real problem. Which is? Colonel Harrison received a message 3 days ago. A rider came from the territorial government with new orders. Chenoa's eyes reflected the starlight filtering through the canyon opening. My cousin works in the fort's kitchen. She hears things. Nash felt his blood turn to ice. What kind of orders? The kind that move up timelines. Your people aren't planning to wait for spring to claim this land. They're planning to act before the first snow, while the weather still allows for major troop movements. Chenoa's grip on his hand tightened. The attack is scheduled for the week after our ceremony. Nash stared at her, feeling the world tilt around him. That's impossible. The logistics alone would require months of planning. Unless the planning was already done, Chenoa interrupted. Unless this was always meant to happen quickly, and your mission was just the final reconnaissance before they moved? The implications crashed over Nash like an avalanche. He hadn't been sent to gather intelligence for a future operation. He'd been sent to confirm final details for an attack that was already in motion. While he'd been falling in love, trying to find alternatives, convincing himself there might be time to change things, his commanders had been positioning troops and making preparations for what they undoubtedly saw as a simple military exercise. How many men were, he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. 3 full companies, plus artillery. Nearly 300 soldiers. Chenoa's voice was steady, but Nash could hear the fear beneath her control. Against maybe 60 warriors, if you count the boys too young and the men too old to fight effectively. Nash closed his eyes, seeing the slaughter that would follow with horrible clarity. The Lakota were fierce fighters, but they'd be outnumbered 5-1, with no advance warning and no time to prepare defenses or evacuate their families. We have to warn your father, he said. Get your people to safety before… Where? Chenoa's question cut through his desperate planning like a blade. Where can we go that the army won't follow? This is our land, Nash. These are our sacred places. We can't just pack up our lives and disappear into the wilderness. Then we fight. I'll help you. I know their tactics, their weaknesses, and become the white traitor who helped massacre American soldiers? Chenoa shook her head. That path leads to your death and accomplishes nothing. They'll just send more troops. Nash felt trapped between impossible choices, each option leading to tragedy. Then what do we do? Chenoa was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the ancient petroglyphs that surrounded them. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new quality, something that sounded almost like hope. We stick to our original plan, but we accelerate it. The ceremony tomorrow night isn't just about choosing a husband anymore. It's about creating a distraction that will let us put our cursed plan into action. How? During the ceremony, while everyone's attention is focused on the ritual, you're going to slip away and return to Fort Laramie. You'll tell Colonel Harrison that you've discovered something terrible about the gold deposits, evidence of the Spanish curse, signs of supernatural protection, whatever will make him reconsider the attack. Nash frowned. He won't believe stories about curses without proof. Then we'll give him proof. Chenoa's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. My grandmother kept records of what happened to the Spanish miners. Detailed accounts of the deaths, the madness, the way the gold seemed to corrupt everyone who touched it. Documents that will look very convincing to a superstitious military commander. And if he still doesn't believe it, then you'll tell him the truth, that the Lakota know about the planned attack, that they're prepared to fight to the death, and that the casualties will be so severe that no amount of gold will justify the political consequences. Chenoa moved closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. You'll tell him that his career will be destroyed when word gets out about the massacre of peaceful people on their own sacred land. Nash felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. It was a desperate plan, full of risks and variables they couldn't control, but it was better than watching helplessly as two worlds destroyed each other. What about the ceremonies, he asked. What about choosing a husband? Chenoa's expression softened, and for a moment she looked like the young woman she really was, instead of the strategic mind that had been plotting their survival. That's where you come in. Me? According to our traditions, I have the right to choose any warrior who has proven himself worthy of our people's trust, any warrior who has shown courage, wisdom, and loyalty to something greater than himself. Nash stared at her, hardly daring to believe what she seemed to be suggesting. Chenoa, I'm not Lakota. Your people would never accept. My people will accept whoever I choose, especially if that choice comes with the blessing of the spirits. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small leather pouch. This contains sacred herbs, blessed by my grandmother before she died. Tomorrow night, during the ceremony, you'll drink a mixture prepared with these herbs. It will alter your perception. Alter it how? You'll see visions. Powerful, convincing visions that will make it clear to everyone present that the spirits approve of our union. Chenoa's eyes glittered with something that might have been mischief if the stakes weren't so deadly. Of course, the visions will be carefully designed to support our larger plan. Nash felt his head spinning as he tried to process everything she was telling him. You want me to fake a spiritual vision in front of your entire tribe? I want you to experience a very real spiritual vision that happens to align with what we need to accomplish. Chenoa corrected. My grandmother's herbs don't create false visions, Nash. They reveal truths that are already present but hidden. If the spirits show you something during the ceremony, it will be because that something is meant to be seen. The wind whispered through Moon Canyon, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Something that felt ancient and powerful and utterly beyond Nash's understanding. He found himself thinking about the petroglyphs on the canyon walls, about the gold that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, about the way Chenoa moved through her world with such certainty and grace. Maybe she was right. Maybe there were truths hidden beneath the surface of reality. Truths that could only be seen when you stop trying to control everything and let yourself trust in something larger than fear. If we do this, Nash said slowly, there's no going back. Once I drink those herbs, once I participate in your ceremony, I'll be committed to this path completely. And if we don't do this, my people die, and your soul dies with them, Chenoa replied. The choice isn't really about going back, Nash. The choice is about going forward. Nash looked at her, memorizing her face in the starlight, knowing that tomorrow night would either save them both or destroy everything they'd built together. What if the visions show me something I don't want to see? What if the spirits disapprove of what we're planning? Chenoa stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin. Then we'll face that truth together. But I don't think that's what will happen. Why not? Because love this strong, love this pure, doesn't come from darkness. It comes from light recognizing itself in another soul. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of worry around his eyes. Tomorrow night, you're going to see yourself as I see you. You're going to understand what my grandmother's visions really meant. Nash caught her hand and held it against his cheek, drawing strength from her touch. And then, and then we saved two worlds from destroying each other, Chenoa whispered, or we die trying. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made every detail of the landscape stand out in sharp relief. Nash went through the motions of being a trader, checking his goods, tending his horse, making polite conversation with the tribal members who still trusted him. But his mind was elsewhere, rehearsing the words he would speak to Colonel Harrison, the arguments he would make, the evidence he would present. As the day wore on, the energy in the camp grew electric with anticipation. The ceremony would begin at sunset, when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. Nash found himself stealing glances at Chenoa throughout the day, watching her prepare for what would either be their wedding ceremony or their funeral. But it wasn't until the sun began to sink toward the western horizon that Nash fully understood what they were about to attempt. This wasn't just about saving her people or stopping a massacre. This was about proving that love could be stronger than the forces that sought to tear the world apart. Tonight he would drink the sacred herbs and open himself to visions that might show him truths he wasn't prepared to face. Tonight he would stand before the Lakota people and ask them to accept a white soldier as one of their own. Tonight everything would change. The only question was whether they would survive what came next. The sacred fire burned higher than Nash had ever seen it, sending sparks spiraling into the star-drunk sky like messages to the spirit world. The entire tribe had gathered in a circle around the flames, their faces painted with traditional symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light. Nash sat beside Chenoa, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared at the small clay cup in his hands. The liquid inside was dark as midnight, with an earthy scent that reminded him of deep forests and ancient secrets. Chenoa's grandmother's herbs, she told him, the gateway to visions that would either save them all or reveal truths too terrible to bear. When you drink, Chenoa whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic drumming that had begun to fill the night air. Don't fight what you see. Don't try to control it. Let the spirits show you what they will. Chief Running Bear stood before the fire, magnificent in his ceremonial robes adorned with eagle feathers and sacred symbols. His voice carried the weight of countless generations as he began the ancient ritual words, calling upon the spirits of earth, air, fire, and water to witness what was about to unfold. Tonight, my daughter will choose her path, Running Bear announced, his gaze sweeping over the assembled tribe. The spirits have whispered to me in dreams of great changes coming, of old ways ending and new ways beginning. Let all who have eyes see, and all who have hearts understand. Nash felt the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes upon him. Some carried curiosity, others suspicion. Dakota's gaze burned with barely concealed hostility, while the elderly women watched with the knowing expressions of those who had seen many ceremonies and understood the deeper currents that moved beneath surface rituals. Drink, Chenoa urged softly. Nash lifted the cup to his lips and swallowed the bitter liquid in one gulp. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world began to shift at the edges, colors becoming more vivid, sounds taking on new dimensions of meaning. The drumbeat seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and gradually Nash became aware that the rhythm was changing, accelerating, drawing him deeper into something that felt like a waking dream. The faces around the fire began to blur and sharpen alternately, as if he was seeing them through water that rippled with each beat of his heart. Chenoa stood and moved to the center of the circle, her movements graceful and purposeful. She began to speak in Lakota, her voice rising and falling with the ancient cadences of ritual speech. Nash found that somehow, impossibly, he could understand every word she spoke. Spirits of my ancestors, I call upon you to witness my choice. I have seen in dreams the warrior who will stand beside me, who will help our people find the path between destruction and survival. Show us now if this vision is true. As if in response to her words, the fire suddenly roared higher, the flames taking on colors Nash had never seen before. Deep blues and purples that seemed to contain entire galaxies within their depths. The drumming intensified, and Nash felt something vast and ancient turning its attention toward their small circle of humanity. That's when the visions began. Nash saw himself as if from above, sitting beside the fire. But now his skin was painted with symbols that glowed like starlight. Beside him sat Chenoa, but she was no longer just a young woman. She was a figure of power, radiating an authority that seemed to bend reality around her. The vision shifted, and Nash found himself standing in a great canyon that stretched beyond the horizon. The walls were covered with petroglyphs that moved and changed as he watched, telling the story of his people and hers in symbols that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to his soul. He saw the coming of the white settlers, wave after wave of them flooding across the land like a great tide. But instead of sweeping everything away, he saw the tide being channeled, guided, shaped by those who understood both the power of water and the strength of stone. Nash saw himself and Chenoa standing together on a high ridge, and from their union came something new. Not the victory of one people over another, but the birth of a new way of being that honored both worlds. He saw children with his eyes and her wisdom, warriors who fought with both sword and spirit, teachers who could speak the languages of all peoples. But then the vision darkened. Nash saw Colonel Harrison leading his 3 companies toward the tribal camp, saw the massacre that would follow if nothing changed. He saw Chenoa's people scattered like leaves before a violent wind, saw the sacred places torn apart in the hunger for gold, saw himself standing alone among the ruins, forever marked as the man who could have prevented the slaughter but chose duty over love. No, Nash whispered, the word torn from his throat by a grief so deep it felt like drowning. The vision shifted again, showing him a different path. He saw himself riding hard toward Fort Laramie, saw his confrontation with Colonel Harrison, saw the moment when the old soldier's face changed from dismissive arrogance to genuine fear as Nash presented the evidence of the curse. But this path, too, led to darkness. Nash saw Harrison calling him a traitor, saw himself facing a firing squad at dawn, saw Chenoa weeping over his grave while her people prepared for a war they could not win. There has to be another way, Nash said, louder now, his voice carrying across the ceremonial circle. The tribe had fallen silent, watching with rapt attention as the white trader spoke to spirits only he could see. Even Dakota's hostility had been replaced by a kind of awed respect for whatever power was moving through the ceremony. The visions came faster now, showing Nash possibility after possibility, each one ending in tragedy until he began to understand that the spirits weren't showing him the future. They were showing him the price of every choice, the weight of responsibility that came with love. And then, suddenly, the vision stopped. Nash found himself staring directly into the sacred fire, but now he could see something in the flames that hadn't been there before. Shapes moved in the dancing light, not random patterns, but deliberate forms that spoke to him with voices older than memory. The gold is not cursed, the fire seemed to whisper. The hearts of men are cursed. But love can break any curse if it's strong enough to choose sacrifice over safety. Nash felt understanding flood through him like lightning. The answer had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. The gold wasn't the real treasure in Moon Canyon. Chenoa's people were. And the only way to save them was to give his enemies exactly what they thought they wanted, while making sure they could never use it. He stood abruptly, swaying slightly as the world tilted around him. The visions were fading, but their message remained crystal clear. Nash turned to face Chief Running Bear, knowing that what he said next would determine the fate of everyone he'd come to care about. "Honored Chief," Nash said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence, "the spirits have shown me the truth. I am not here by accident. I am here because the old ways are ending, and something new must be born to take their place." Running Bear's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gestured for Nash to continue. "I was sent by my people to gather information about your sacred places, to help them plan an attack that would drive you from this land forever." Nash heard the sharp intake of breath from the assembled tribe, felt the sudden tension that rippled through the circle like wildfire. "But the spirits have shown me that this attack will destroy more than your people. It will destroy the soul of my people as well." Dakota was on his feet now, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. "You dare admit your treachery in our sacred circle?" "I admit my awakening," Nash replied, meeting the warrior's furious gaze without flinching. The spirits have shown me that the only way to save both our peoples is to become something new. Not white, not Lakota, but something that bridges both worlds. Nash turned back to Running Bear, knowing he was about to risk everything on a plan so audacious it could only have come from the spirits themselves. Chief Running Bear, I ask for your daughter's hand in marriage. Not as a white man seeking to possess what belongs to your people, but as a warrior willing to die for something greater than himself. Nash's voice grew stronger as he spoke, drawing power from the certainty that flowed through him. And I ask for your help in preventing a massacre that will stain this land with innocent blood. The silence that followed was so complete that Nash could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Then slowly, Chief Running Bear smiled. The spirits have spoken through you, Nash Bradley, the chief said, using Nash's real name for the first time. And what they have said, this is something we will discuss when the ceremony is complete. Running Bear gestured to Chenoa, who stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of hope, of love finally finding its voice. Do you accept this man as your husband? Running Bear asked his daughter. I do, Chenoa whispered, her voice carrying the weight of destiny. Then let the spirits witness your union, Running Bear declared, and may they give you the strength for what lies ahead. As Nash and Chenoa joined hands before the sacred fire, neither of them knew that 3 miles away, a cavalry messenger was riding hard toward Fort Laramie with orders that would change everything. The real test was just beginning. The wedding celebration lasted until dawn, but Nash barely tasted the feast or heard the congratulations. His mind was already racing toward Fort Laramie, calculating distances and timing, knowing that every moment he delayed could mean the difference between salvation and slaughter. As the first pale light of morning crept across the horizon, Nash pulled Chenoa aside from the dispersing crowd of well-wishers. They walked to the edge of the camp, where the prairie stretched endlessly toward the rising sun. I have to leave now, Nash said, his voice heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. If I'm going to reach Colonel Harrison before he finalizes the attack plans, I can't wait any longer. Chenoa nodded, though he could see the fear she was trying to hide behind her composed expression. How long do we have? If the attack is really scheduled for next week, then maybe 3 days before the advance scouts start moving. Less if Harrison decides to accelerate the timeline again. Nash took her hands in his, memorizing the feel of her fingers against his palm. Can your people be ready to evacuate by then, if my plan fails? My people don't evacuate, Chenoa replied firmly. This is our land, Nash. These are our sacred places. We'll fight to defend them, even if it means dying. Nash felt his chest tighten at the certainty in her voice. Then I better make sure my plan doesn't fail. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not the familiar rhythm of tribal horses, but the harder, more urgent cadence of a military mount being ridden at speed. Nash instinctively stepped in front of Chenoa, his hand moving toward the pistol concealed beneath his trader's coat. A rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the dawn sky. Even at a distance, Nash could see the blue uniform of a cavalry trooper, the glint of metal from weapons and equipment. The horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting a hard ride through the night. That's not good, Nash muttered. The messenger, for that's clearly what he was, rode directly toward the camp with the kind of purposeful urgency that spoke of important news. Nash felt his blood turn to ice as he recognized the man's face. Corporal James Mitchell, one of Colonel Harrison's most trusted couriers. Stay behind me, Nash whispered to Chenoa as Mitchell approached. And whatever happens, don't let on that you understand English. Mitchell reined in his horse 20 feet away, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before him. His gaze lingered on Nash with obvious suspicion, noting the way the supposed traitor stood protectively in front of the chief's daughter. You there, Mitchell called out in English. Traitor, I'm looking for a man named Nash Bradley. You seen him around these parts? Nash felt his world narrow to this single moment, this crucial decision point that would determine everything that followed. He could deny knowing the name, try to maintain his cover a little longer, but something in Mitchell's expression told him it was already too late for deception. I'm Nash Bradley, he said simply. Mitchell's hand moved to his sidearm, though he didn't draw it yet. Nash Bradley died 3 weeks ago in a Lakota raid near Silver Creek. Least, that's what his horse and gear suggested when we found them scattered across the prairie. Nash felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to fake his death, which meant, "Who sent you here, Corporal?" "Colonel Harrison. Seems he got word that somebody matching your description was seen trading with Chief Running Bear's people. Wanted me to check it out, see if our missing scout had somehow survived and decided to go native." Mitchell's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. Guess the Colonel's instincts were right on target. Behind Nash, more tribal members were starting to take notice of the exchange. He could sense Chief Running Bear approaching, along with several warriors including Dakota. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. "What's the message, Mitchell?" Nash asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Message is simple. You're to return to Fort Laramie immediately for debriefing. Colonel's got some questions about your activities over the past few weeks." Mitchell's grin turned predatory. "Questions about whether you've been providing intelligence to the enemy." Nash felt the trap closing around him. If he went with Mitchell, he'd likely face a court-martial and execution for treason. If he refused, Mitchell would report back that Nash had indeed turned traitor, confirming Harrison's worst suspicions and possibly accelerating the attack timeline. But then Mitchell said something that changed everything. "Of course, the Colonel also wanted me to tell you that the situation's changed. We received new orders from Washington yesterday. Seems the territorial governor got wind of our plans and decided to expedite the operation." Mitchell's smile grew wider. "Attack's been moved up to tomorrow night. Gives you just enough time to ride back and provide final intelligence on tribal defenses before we move." Tomorrow night. Nash felt the blood drain from his face. Not a week, not even 3 days. Less than 24 hours before 300 soldiers would descend on the camp where he'd just been married, where children played and elders shared stories, and his new wife slept peacefully in her father's lodge. "You look pale, Bradley," Mitchell observed. "Something wrong with the new timeline?" Nash forced himself to think, to calculate, to find some advantage in what seemed like an impossible situation. Mitchell didn't know about the marriage ceremony. As far as the corporal was concerned, Nash was still an undercover operative who might be having doubts but hadn't yet committed any overt acts of treason. "Just surprised by the acceleration," Nash managed. "Will the men be ready for night operations on such short notice?" "Colonel Harrison's been preparing for rapid deployment since the day you left. Men, equipment, artillery. Everything's been staged and ready to move for over a week." Mitchell's expression grew suspicious again. "Why do you ask?" Having second thoughts about the mission? Nash knew his next words would seal his fate one way or another. Behind him, he could hear Chief Running Bear speaking quietly in Lakota, probably asking Chenoa what was happening. Soon the chief would intervene, and then there would be no more pretense possible. "No second thoughts," Nash lied smoothly. "Just want to make sure I provide the most accurate intelligence possible. Tell me, what's the specific target for tomorrow night?" Mitchell glanced around at the tribal camp, his eyes cold and calculating. "Complete pacification. Colonel's orders are to eliminate all resistance and secure the area for geological survey. Any tribal members who surrender will be relocated to the reservation. Any who resist—" He shrugged eloquently. Nash felt something break inside his chest. These people had welcomed him, trusted him, included him in their most sacred ceremonies. And now he was listening to a man casually discuss their extermination as if it were a routine military exercise. "I see," Nash said quietly. "And the timeline for my return?" "Colonel expects you back by sunset tonight. That'll give you time to brief the attack commanders on defensive positions, leadership structure, and any other intelligence you've gathered." Mitchell checked the position of the sun, calculating travel time. "If you leave within the hour, you should make it with time to spare." Chief Running Bear chose that moment to approach, his presence commanding even though he moved with the careful dignity of age. He spoke in Lakota, his words directed at Chenoa, but clearly intended for Nash's understanding as well. "My daughter tells me this man brings news from your people. Is this news that affects our conversation from last night?" Nash felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him again. He could warn Running Bear directly, But that would expose his betrayal in front of Mitchell, ensuring that the corporal would ride back to report Nash's treason. The attack would proceed as planned, but with the knowledge that Nash had turned against his own people. Alternatively, he could maintain his cover, ride back to Fort Laramie with Mitchell, and try to convince Colonel Harrison to call off the attack. But with less than 24 hours and such overwhelming evidence of the gold deposits, what argument could possibly sway a man like Harrison? Then Nash remembered something Shanoa had said during their planning sessions. Something about giving Harrison a reason to look elsewhere for his gold, about making the cost of taking this land higher than any potential gain. Chief Running Bear, Nash said carefully, speaking in English so Mitchell could understand, this man brings word that some of my people are planning to visit your lands very soon. They're interested in the geological formations in this area. Running Bear's eyes sharpened with understanding. And what is your counsel regarding this visit? Nash met the chief's gaze steadily. I counsel that you might want to show them just how dangerous these geological formations can be. Sometimes the earth itself objects to being disturbed. Mitchell frowned, clearly not understanding the subtext of the conversation. Bradley, what the hell are you talking about? Just making sure the chief understands the importance of cooperation, Nash replied smoothly. Then switching to the few words of Lakota he'd learned, he added, spirits angry, gold cursed, death comes with sunrise. Running Bear nodded once, a gesture so subtle that Mitchell missed it entirely. But Nash saw the understanding pass between them, saw the chief's expression harden with resolve. I think, Running Bear said slowly in English, that your people may find our lands inhospitable. The spirits here do not welcome those who come with greed in their hearts. Nash felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could make Colonel Harrison believe in the supernatural dangers of disturbing sacred ground, it would be Chief Running Bear himself. Perhaps, Nash said, his mind racing with the outline of a desperate plan, the chief would be willing to ride back with us, to explain to my commander personally why these lands should remain untouched. Mitchell's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been greed. Bringing back both the missing scout and a high-ranking tribal chief would definitely impress Colonel Harrison. That's actually not a bad idea, Mitchell admitted. Colonel would want to hear directly from tribal leadership before proceeding. Nash turned to Running Bear, hoping the chief would understand what he was really asking. Would you be willing to speak with our war chief? To tell him about the spiritual dangers of disturbing this land? Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he smiled, and Nash saw something almost predatory in the expression. Yes, the chief said. I think it's time your war chief learned the truth about what lies beneath our sacred ground. The ride to Fort Laramie felt like a funeral procession, though Nash couldn't decide whether they were riding toward salvation or doom. Chief Running Bear sat his horse with the dignity of a king, showing no fear despite riding directly into the heart of enemy territory. Corporal Mitchell alternated between suspicious glances at Nash and calculating looks at the chief, clearly imagining the commendation he'd receive for bringing back such valuable prizes. Nash's mind raced through possibilities as they covered the dusty miles. In less than 18 hours, 300 soldiers would march toward the tribal camp where Chenoa waited. Everything depended on the next few hours, on his ability to convince Colonel Harrison that the cost of taking the sacred land would be higher than any potential gain. Fort Laramie appeared on the horizon just as the sun reached its zenith, its wooden walls and guard towers stark against the endless prairie. Nash felt his chest tighten as they approached the gates. Once inside, there would be no escape, no opportunity to warn Chenoa if the plan failed. Everything hinged on Chief Running Bear's ability to project supernatural authority and Nash's skill at reading Colonel Harrison's superstitious nature. Halt! State your business, called the guard at the gate. Corporal Mitchell returning with Nash Bradley and a Lakota chief for Colonel Harrison, Mitchell replied, his voice filled with self-importance. The guard's eyes widened as he took in the unlikely trio. Wait here. Within minutes, Colonel Harrison himself appeared at the gate, flanked by 2 lieutenants and a dozen armed soldiers. Nash studied his commanding officer's face, looking for signs of the man's mood and intentions. Harrison was in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered features of a career military man. But Nash had always noticed something else in the colonel's eyes, a hunger that went beyond duty or patriotism. "Well, well," Harrison said, his gaze moving from Nash to Chief Running Bear with obvious calculation. "Nash Bradley, we were told you were dead." "Reports of my death were premature, sir," Nash replied carefully. "Indeed, and you've brought a guest." Harrison turned his attention to Running Bear, and Nash saw the colonel's expression shift to something between respect and predatory interest. "Chief Running Bear, I presume. Your reputation precedes you." Running Bear remained silent, his weathered face impassive as stone. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You are the war chief who plans to disturb the sacred places of my people." It wasn't a question, and Harrison's slight smile confirmed that the chief's directness had caught him off guard. "I am Colonel Harrison, and I have orders to secure certain strategic territories for the United States government." "Strategic!" Running Bear repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "You mean the cursed gold that lies beneath our burial grounds?" Nash watched Harrison's face carefully, seeing the flicker of surprise that the chief knew about the gold deposits. But there was something else there too, a shadow that crossed the colonel's features when Running Bear mentioned a curse. "Cursed?" Harrison laughed, but Nash could hear the forced quality in the sound. "Chief, I'm a military man. I don't put much stock in superstition." Running Bear's eyes glittered dangerously. "No." "Then why do you carry 3 silver coins in your left pocket, always checking them before making important decisions? Why do you refuse to sleep in any tent that faces north? Why do you order your men to avoid black cats and broken mirrors?" Nash felt his breath catch. The chief had done his homework, gathering intelligence about Harrison's superstitious habits with the same thoroughness the colonel used for military planning. Harrison's face darkened. "How do you—" "The spirits whisper many things to those who listen," Running Bear interrupted. "They have whispered about you, Colonel Harrison. They know what you plan, and they are displeased." "Sir," Mitchell interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, "Bradley has intelligence about tribal defenses that—" "Silence!" Harrison snapped, his attention fixed entirely on Running Bear. "What do you mean, displeased?" Running Bear dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and somehow ominous. "The gold you seek has been protected by my people's spirits for generations. It is not merely metal hidden in stone. It is the blood of the earth, the tears of our ancestors, the price of maintaining balance between the world of the living and the world of the dead." Nash watched, fascinated despite the danger, as Running Bear began to weave a story with the skill of a master storyteller. The chief spoke of Spanish conquistadors who had tried to mine the sacred hills centuries ago, of madness and death that followed them until none remained. He described visions of gold that turned to ash in men's hands, of soldiers who found wealth only to lose their souls. "But surely you don't believe," Harrison began. "I believe in evidence," Running Bear said firmly. He reached into his ceremonial pouch and pulled out a piece of metal that glittered in the afternoon sun. "Behold, gold from the sacred hills." Harrison's eyes locked onto the metal with unmistakable hunger. That's substantial, pure by the look of it." "Take it," Running Bear said, extending the gold toward the colonel. "Take it and see for yourself whether the spirit's protection is real." Nash held his breath as Harrison reached for the gold. The moment the colonel's fingers closed around the metal, Running Bear began to speak in Lakota, his voice rising and falling in the ancient rhythms of spiritual invocation. Harrison's expression changed almost immediately. His face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. His hand began to tremble as he stared at the gold, and Nash could see sweat beading on the man's forehead despite the cool afternoon air. What did you do?" Harrison whispered. "I did nothing," Running Bear replied calmly. "The spirits speak for themselves. Tell me, Colonel, what do you see when you look at that gold?" Harrison's breathing became labored, his eyes wide with terror. "Blood," he gasped. "I see blood. And bodies. So many bodies." He tried to drop the gold, but his fingers seemed frozen around it. "Make it stop." The spirits show you the truth of what will come if you disturb the sacred places, Running Bear said, his voice filled with terrible authority. They show you the price of your greed, not just the death of my people, but the destruction of your own soul. Nash realized what was happening. The gold wasn't gold at all. It was some kind of ceremonial metal that Running Bear had treated with the same herbs Chenoa had used for Nash's vision quest. Harrison was experiencing hallucinations, but to a superstitious man, they would be indistinguishable from supernatural visions. Please, Harrison begged, still unable to release the metal, make it stop. The spirits will be silent when you abandon your plans to desecrate our sacred land, Running Bear declared. Swear by your God and your honor that you will call off the attack and the visions will end. Nash could see the war between Harrison's military ambitions and his superstitious terror playing out across the man's face. The colonel was strong-willed and experienced, but he was also deeply afraid of forces he couldn't understand or control. I can't, Harrison gasped. Orders from Washington, the territorial governor. Then you choose gold over your soul, Running Bear said sadly, and you choose the death of everyone under your command. The chief gestured to Nash, who stepped forward on cue. Colonel, with respect, I've seen what Chief Running Bear is talking about. The Spanish records, the unexplained deaths, the way the land itself seems to resist intrusion. Sir, I believe the spiritual protections are real. Harrison looked at Nash with desperate eyes. You've seen it too? Yes, sir. And I believe that any attempt to take that gold will result in casualties far beyond what Washington is prepared to accept. Nash pressed his advantage. Sir, your career, your men's lives, your own soul, is any amount of gold worth that risk? For a long moment, the only sound was Harrison's labored breathing. Then suddenly, he screamed and hurled the metal away from him. It landed in the dust with a dull thud, and immediately his trembling stopped. Harrison stared at the discarded metal, then at Running Bear, then at Nash. What were those visions? A glimpse of the future if you proceed with your plans, Running Bear said simply. The spirits offer you one chance to choose differently. Will you take it? Nash watched his commanding officer struggle with the decision that would determine the fate of two peoples. Harrison was a career soldier, ambitious and ruthless, but he was also a man haunted by superstitions and fears he couldn't rationalize away. If I call off the attack, Harrison said slowly, I'll need a report that justifies the decision to my superiors. Then you shall have one, Nash replied immediately. A detailed intelligence report documenting the supernatural defenses protecting the site, the historical evidence of what happens to those who disturb sacred ground, and the strategic recommendation that we seek gold deposits elsewhere. Harrison nodded slowly, his face still pale but his voice growing stronger. And if Washington sends investigators, they will find a chief who is willing to demonstrate the spiritual protections to anyone brave enough to experience them personally, Running Bear said with a slight smile. Nash felt relief flood through him as he saw Harrison's resolve crumble in the face of forces he couldn't understand or defeat. The colonel would call off the attack, the tribal camp would be safe, and Chenoa would live to see another sunrise. But as they turned to enter the fort and begin drafting the necessary reports, Nash caught sight of movement on the horizon. A dust cloud was approaching fast, too fast for normal travel. Another messenger was coming, and Nash had a terrible feeling that their carefully constructed plan was about to face its greatest test yet. Colonel, Nash said urgently, you might want to make those orders official as quickly as possible. Harrison followed Nash's gaze and saw the approaching rider. His face hardened with the look of a man who sensed that his moment of supernatural terror was about to be challenged by very earthly consequences. 10 years later, Nash Bradley stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching his 7-year-old son teach his younger sister how to braid leather into rope. The boy had Chenoa's dark eyes and Nash's stubborn determination, while the girl possessed her mother's grace and her father's restless spirit. The ranch sat exactly where Moon Canyon opened onto the prairie, a deliberate choice that honored both worlds Nash and Chenoa had sworn to bridge. The hidden canyon remained sacred, untouched, its golden walls still whispering ancient secrets to those who knew how to listen. but the surrounding land had become something new, a place where Lakota wisdom and frontier innovation worked hand in hand. "Papa, tell us again about the cursed gold," little Sarah asked, looking up from her braiding lesson with bright, curious eyes. Nash smiled, settling into his favorite rocking chair as Chenoa emerged from the house, carrying a tray of fresh-baked bread and honey. Even after a decade of marriage, the sight of her still made his heart race like a young man's. "The gold wasn't really cursed, sweetheart," Nash explained, pulling his daughter onto his lap. "Your mother's grandfather just used very special herbs that made Colonel Harrison see things that weren't really there. But the spirits were real," Chenoa added, sitting beside her husband and taking his hand. "The protection of the sacred places, the wisdom that guided us to find another way, that was real. Sometimes the truth needs help being seen." Their son, Michael, looked up from his rope work with the serious expression he'd inherited from both parents. "What happened to the messenger who came at the end?" "You never finished that part of the story." Nash and Chenoa exchanged a glance that held 10 years' worth of shared memories, challenges overcome, and love deepened by time and trial. "The messenger brought news that the territorial governor had been replaced," Nash said. "Seems someone in Washington had finally started asking questions about why so many gold prospecting operations were ending in mysterious disasters. The new governor was more interested in peaceful solutions than profitable wars. Plus," Chenoa added with a mischievous smile, "word had gotten out about the cursed gold of the Sacred Hills. Funny how quickly superstitious miners started looking for easier deposits to work." Nash chuckled, remembering how effectively Running Bear's reputation for supernatural protection had spread throughout the territory. The chief had become something of a legend, the Indian leader who could drive away entire armies with nothing but his spiritual authority. "The important thing," Nash told his children, "is that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is find a way for everyone to win. Your mother taught me that love doesn't conquer by defeating enemies. It conquers by turning enemies into family." As the sun set over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nash reflected on how different his life had become from what he'd originally planned. He'd started as a soldier following orders, but he'd become something far more valuable: a bridge between worlds, a keeper of peace, a man who'd learned that the greatest treasures weren't hidden in the ground, but built in the heart. Hey there, Wild West lovers! What did you think of Nash and Chenoa's incredible journey? This story of forbidden love, supernatural courage, and the power of finding peaceful solutions in the midst of conflict shows us that sometimes the most unlikely alliances can change the course of history. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video if you believe love can conquer even the deepest prejudices. Subscribe to Wild West Stories for more epic tales of frontier romance, courage, and the untamed American spirit. Comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Nash's position? Would you have chosen duty or love? Share this story with someone who believes in second chances and the power of love to overcome impossible odds. Wild West Stories, where legends live, love conquers all, and every sunset brings a new beginning.